Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of It's Old News 250. Previously on, last week, we talked about tensions building over tea sent to America. There were some events primarily taking place in Boston that are kind of precursors to the Boston Tea Party, which is happening in about 2 weeks. So we're going to see more news stories about that this week. Also, Native Americans visit Sir William Johnson over the murder of four French merchants. The Ohio colony. There were many doubters of the Ohio colony on whether it would even exist, but the article we saw in last week's papers suggested that you know the preparations for the Ohio colony are at an end, and they are expecting the papers to be sent over on the next package ship. And lastly, we saw some British military updates, a reorganization of the headquarters to New York City and the second headquarters down in Charlestown, South Carolina. We also saw some positions of several regiments and also a review of a regiment of Welsh Fusiliers. All right, let's get started on this episode. News from America. Boston, November 29th, 1773. The tea has arrived. Yesterday morning, Captain Hall and the ship Dartmouth anchored in the harbor near the castle. Early this morning, he came into town and notified he had 114 chests of the East India's tea on board. And this morning, the following notification was posted up in all parts of the town. Friends, brethren, countrymen, that worst of plagues, the detestable tea shipped for this port by the East India Company, is now arrived in this harbor. The hour of destruction or manly opposition to the machinations of tyranny stares you in the face. Every friend to his country, to himself and posterity, is now called upon to meet at Faneuil Hall at 9 o'clock this day, at which time the bell will ring, to make a united and successful resistance to this last, worst, and most destructive measure of administration. A meeting was held at 9 a.m. and continued to the next day to determine the most proper method to prevent the unloading or vending of the tea that arrived in the harbor. Jonathan Williams was chosen moderator of the meeting, and a motion was made. The question at hand was whether the tea should be sent back to where it came from, and the answer was yes. There were so many people at the meeting that the hall could not fit everyone, so it was agreed to reconvene at the Old South Meeting House. Another motion was made, and the question was asked whether not only should the tea be sent back, but no duty shall be paid either, and the answer was yes as well. To give the tea consignees time to deliberate and consider before sending their proposals, the meeting was adjourned until 3 p.m. Now, if you saw last week's episode, just to give a recap, there was 6 men that were basically merchants in Boston. 2 of them were sons of Governor Hutchinson, Thomas Hutchinson, and they were appointed to be tea consignees of the East India tea shipping to Boston, and they were going to be selling the tea in their shops. And this basically, their resistance of giving up their positions as tea consignees angered the majority of the townspeople in Boston, and in their eyes made them an enemy of the people. A motion was made at 3 p.m. whether the tea should be shipped back in the same ship that it arrived in Mr. Hall's, and the answer was yes. The ship's owner, Mr. Roch, was present and made a formal protest against the proceedings. It was then moved and voted that Mr. Roch be directed not to unload any of the tea, and doing so would be at his peril. It was also voted that Mr. Hall, the captain of the ship, also be directed that unloading any of the tea would be at his peril as well. It was voted, in order to ensure the security of Captain Hall's ship and cargo, a 25-man watch would be created. Captain Edward Proctor was appointed the captain of the watch for the night, and the names of the volunteers were given to the moderator, Mr. Jonathan Williams. It has been observed that Governor Hutchinson had requested the justice of the peace to suppress any riots that might happen. The question was asked whether the governor's conduct is solely calculated to serve the views of administration, and the answer was yes. Colonel Hancock informed the people that Mr. Copley, son-in-law to Mr. Clark, informed him that the tea consignees were unable to gather to finalize their proposals, not being in the same vicinity, and would like to set another time for that purpose. The meeting was adjourned to the next morning to allow them the time they needed to finish their proposal. The proposals were delivered Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. The proposals were not directed to the moderator, but to John Scauley, one of the selectmen. It was voted they be read, and they are as follows. Sir, we are sorry that we could not return to the town satisfactory answers to their too late messages to us respecting the tea. We beg leave to acquaint the gentlemen selectmen that we have since received our orders from the Honorable East India Company. We still retain a disposition to do all in our power to give satisfaction to the town, just as we understood from you and the other gentlemen selectmen at Monsieur Clark's interview with you last Saturday that this can be effected by nothing less than our sending back the teas. We beg leave to say that this is utterly out of our power to do, but we do now declare to you our readiness to store the teas until we shall have an opportunity of writing to our constituents and shall receive their further orders regarding them, and we do most sincerely with that the town considering the unexpected difficulties devolved upon us with what we now offer. Mr. Sheriff Greenleaf came into the meeting with a letter he received from the governor that contained a proclamation. It was voted that the proclamation was to be read and is as follows. To Jonathan Williams, acting as moderator of an assembly of people in the town of Boston, and to the people so assembled. Whereas printed notifications were on Monday the 29th passed on several places in the town of Boston and published in the newspapers of that day, calling upon the people to assemble for certain unlawful purposes in such notifications mentioned. And whereas great numbers of people belonging to the town of Boston and divers others belonging to other towns in the province did assemble in the said town of Boston on that said day, and did then and there proceed to choose a moderator, and consult, debate, and resolve upon ways and means for carrying such unlawful purposes into execution. Openly violating and setting at naught the good and wholesome laws of the province and the constitution of government under which they live. In faithfulness to my trust as His Majesty's representative within the province, I am bound to bear testimony against this violation of the laws, and I warn, exhort, and require you, and each of you thus unlawfully assembled, forthwith to disperse and to surcease all further unlawful proceedings at your utmost peril. Immediately after the sheriff was done reading, there was a loud and very general hiss. A motion was made, and the question asked whether the assembly would disperse and surcease all further proceedings according to the governor's requirement, and the answer was no. That concludes the meetings of the day. On the same day, November 30th, later that night, a violent armed robbery. Last Tuesday, between 9 and 10 p.m., several seafaring men belonging to an outbound vessel went to the home of Captain Joshua Beale in Royal Exchange Lane, where people victualled and lodged. The sailors, being armed with clubs and cutlasses, attacked the people inside. One man had part of his skull sliced off. Mrs. Beale was thrown out of a window, and her daughter was knocked down in the yard while trying to escape. Captain Beale jumped out of a window to save his life, and the sailors then proceeded to rob the house of valuables. New York, November 11th, 1773, an effigy of an enemy. An effigy of a man named William Kelly, who no longer resides in New York but gained his means of importance there, was created, and it was paraded through most of the principal streets in the city and was burned outside of a coffee house. William Kelly became an enemy to the liberty in America when he made some remarks about the people of New York to get the commissions for the sale of tea. There was no danger of the resentment of the people of New York if it should be as high as it was in the time of the Stamp Act, that then they had an old man, Mr. Colden, to deal with, but now they have Governor Tryon, a military man, who had suppressed the insurrection in North Carolina, and he would cram the tea down their throats. The words of William Kelly emboldened the East India Company to send the tea to America. He is dubbed an enemy to his country for the above resolutions. The effigy of William Kelly was suspended hanging with a halter on the middle of a gallows, fixed on a cart with his hands pinioned. On the right side of the gallows was fixed a horrid representation of the devil, with the left arm over the gallows, the body inclining forward, and a harpoon in his right hand. The gallows was illuminated with 3 large lanterns. On Kelly's breast was a label with these words, "The just reward of that black and horrid crime, ingratitude." And there was another on his back that said, "A disgrace to my country." New Jersey, November 11th, 1773. A robbery and counterfeit. By a proclamation from William Franklin, governor of New Jersey, Samuel Ford from Morris County has been charged for the robbery of the treasury of the Eastern Division in 1768. Samuel has also been indicted by a grand jury for feloniously counterfeiting the bills of credit for New Jersey and Philadelphia. Also, Joseph Richardson and John King from Morris County have been charged with aiding and abetting Samuel Ford in passing the counterfeit bills. A reward of £300 has been set for the capture of Samuel Ford and Joseph Richardson. Quebec, October 29, 1773, a sinking ship. On October 18th, the ship Matilda from Philadelphia was on its way to Quebec when it ran aground on the point of Alouette near Saguenay River, about 35 leagues away. The captain arrived in Quebec seeking assistance and said when he left the ship there was 6 feet of water in the hold. He set off Sunday evening in a schooner, but they lost their anchor and boat in a gale at Patrick's Hole, and the ship Albany, which left at the same time, also received some damage. Both returned yesterday afternoon to resupply. News from Europe. July 12th, the plague has claimed 100,000 lives in Basora, which is now Basra, Iraq, and 200,000 in Baghdad. August 1st, Russian troops take possession of the town of Azov on the River Don after a land and sea battle where 6 of the Turkish galleys were sunk. September 2nd, Her Russian Imperial Majesty has ordered the dockyards in Riga to be enlarged for the purpose of building some first and second-rate ships of war and plans to turn this port into the finest in her dominion. 2 90-gun ships are nearly finished and will be 2 of the finest in the north of Europe. September 1st, a lieutenant of the Russian Hussars arrived in Vienna and reported fresh action in Moldavia. The Turks 3,000 men against the Russians 2,500, while the Russians were on the way to take the town of Breza. A Russian victory was declared with 400 Turks killed and 600 captured. August 3rd. Military preparations in Berlin are carried on with greater vigor than ever, and there are now 40,000 men fit to bear arms, all of whom are embodied in regiments of horse and foot. September 13th. All eyes are on the warlike preparations of the Emperor and the King of Prussia, whether this is for the offensive or defensive, or they are going to act in conjunction, only they know in secret. Letters from Falkland Islands mention that a group of 34 Spaniards had strayed up the country from Magellan as far as Chile in search of gold mines, which they found, and the Chilean Indians had kept from them, knowing it would incite their thirst of conquest. Before they could get back to inform their countrymen where the mines lay, the Chileans seized them and put them to death. We hear 3,000 men are shortly to be drafted from marching regiments and embarked for North America. The French are building several ships of the line and others at the ports of Corsica, where many Genoese shipwrights and carpenters are engaged. All right, this concludes the old news from America and Europe. Thanks for watching. Check back next week for more stories from the past on It's Old News. Once again, I'm going to leave you for a minute or two here to take a look at some old advertisements that were in last week's newspapers. These ones are from Philadelphia in the Pennsylvania Gazette. This may be news to you, but it's old news. See you again next time.